Chris O'Connor here. Join the Curmudgeon Rock Report's invite-only curmudgeonly community at facebook.com/curmudgeonrock. Also look out for a Spotify playlist that pays honor to this episode.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. So, our third golden age of rock series, which covers the period when punk, post-punk, new wave permanently altered not just the rock music landscape, but popular culture in general, has now reached its midway point, and that midway point is the year 1978. During this time, the subgenre and punk rock offshoot known as new wave acquired a bad reputation among the hipster cognoscenti sections of both fans and critics for being a watered-down, corporatized version of punk rock. However, in retrospect, with the passage of decades, new wave indeed proved to be artistically valid and deeply influential, with the release of classic albums and singles by the likes of Elvis Costello, Devo, The Cars, and a trio of New York CBGB acts, Blondie, Talking Heads, and Patti Smith. Punk's other offshoot, post-punk, developed its abrasive and art-damaged sound in the UK with John Lydon's post-Sex Pistols outfit, Public Image Ltd, and Siouxsie and the Banshees releasing their debut albums, while Wire's sophomore album raised the bar for challenging, thrilling art rock. Some of both rock and R&B's more established acts also had a seminal year for all-time great releases. George Clinton transposed the hardcore funk of Parliament to his earlier band, Funkadelic, and dropped the classic One Nation Under a Groove. At the same time, Marvin Gaye finally divorced his wife, Anna Gordy, sister of Motown head honcho Berry Gordy, and part of the divorce settlement was that all profits from Gaye's next album would go to Gordy. The result was one of the biggest fuck you statements in pop music history and a breathtakingly fantastic double album in Here, My Dear. Bruce Springsteen followed up Born to Run, an instant classic that was immediately hailed at the time of its release as one of the best albums ever, by putting out an even better album with the darker, moodier, more mature, more lyrically expansive Darkness on the Edge of Town, an album that is arguably the Boss's greatest record. And coming out of Southern California with a blaze of fire, Van Halen's self-titled debut introduced a brash, flashy, campy, new kind of post-Zeppelin heavy metal that would have an enormous influence on the glam metal of the 1980s to come. And with Eddie Van Halen, a new kind of virtuoso guitar hero was born. We'll also do a rundown of some of the great punk, post-punk, new wave singles of this year, as well as our usual lightning round rundown of other classic albums from this underratedly terrific year. Disco may have been all the rage during this time, but rock was going through some fascinating foundational changes for the next decade and beyond. Welcome to the 1978 installment of the third golden age of rock, and welcome to the Curmudgeon Rock Report.
Welcome to 2025, everyone. Goodbye, 2024. Hello, 2025. Time to keep rocking in the free world, huh, Art?
Yes, and it's kind of like this episode where we're like right smack in the middle of our third golden age of rock series, and it's really interesting how rock music in general changed so much in this particular period of time. People think of, the 1960s, of course, and we did our second golden age on that. That was really important. And of course, the fourth golden age of basically the 1990s. But this is a pivotal era. Because it really is a demarcation between old school classic rock and everything that came after, alternative, indie, goth, blah, 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 all that stuff.
Yeah, post-punk and everything else. And so it's just kind of neat that, here's another thought for you. So when we were kids back in 1993, 47 years prior to that would have been 1946. I don't think you and I were sitting around talking about the glories, gloriously reminiscing about the Andrews sisters and Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra when we were 18 years old. However, there are 18-year-olds out there that are probably vibing to punk rock and to some of the albums and to some of the artists that we're talking about.
It just tells you how timeless this music actually is.
Yeah, rock and roll. I mean, yeah, definitely. It's definitely, more than big band, more than swing, any of that. That there's an indelibility to rock and roll that truly never will die. I mean, the song lyric is a cliche, but it's pretty much true, So anyway, with that said, let's kick off the year with our by traveling to our favorite place, not of this universe. It is in the parallel universe that we shall travel to. Art. Let's enjoy the romp on the other side of the space-time continuum, where rock and roll was still predominant, and it's still awesome, and it's still rocking like Dokken, although better than Dokken.
Way better. Dokken sucked.
Yeah. But they had cool jean patches, though. Like jean jacket patches. They really were there. And hey, they did the theme song to Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3. So can't diss them totally.
Part 3, mind you. Ooh.
Ooh, yeah. Dream Warriors. So anyway, after that diversion, let us focus on the parallel universe. Yes, it's true. Rock and roll predominates over here, and it's still a thing in the arenas and on the billboards. And there's actually such a thing as more than one rock station in big markets in the parallel universe. And so we celebrate this music, and rock stars are still rock stars, and rock bands are still the thing. That's a long, fancy way of saying that this is the second minute of the show where we cover new and newish artists that we think that you would dig and in a different era might have actually achieved some measure of stardom. So, Arturo, with that said, who are you covering this week in our parallel universe?
Yeah, since it's still very, very early in the year as we're recording this episode, it's also a bit too early to highlight new albums worthy of existing in our parallel universe where rock music is still popular and still part of the pop cultural zeitgeist. So in order to honor this episode that looks back on the year 1978, the year when rock music was caught between punk and post-punk, I'm reaching into the parallel vault and discuss an album that came out within the past 10 years, one that echoes that post-punk spirit of 1978. And I've chosen the now defunct Washington, D.C. band Priests and their 2017 debut album, Nothing Feels Natural. When this record dropped and garnered vast critical praise, as well as great social media word of mouth, it must have seemed like a breath of fresh air to a rock music scene inundated by wimpy indie pop and moody, mellow, ethereal, droning synth pop. Epic album opener appropriate blasts out of the gate with an angry, abrasive, dissonant guitar-heavy attack that recalls Wire at their heaviest, joining forces with the Slits. This challenging album opener makes the listener keep their guard up, which makes it all the more surprising when they follow that track up with the very Pixies-esque surf rock of JJ. Layla 20 rolls along with a groovy mid-tempo shuffle that brings to mind the post-punk soul hybrid sound of Siouxsie and the Banshees, while on No Big Bang, the lead singer Katie Alice Greer does her best impression of Patti Smith's feverish rush of spoken word poetry as the band does its best impression of bass-driven Joy Division rock. Album closer Suck is one of the record standouts, sounding something like Slater-Kinney embracing funk. After the critical success of Nothing Feels Natural, the band recoiled from the punk and post-punk tags that they felt they were pigeonholed into. And with their second album, 2019's The Seduction of Kansas, they broke out the synthesizers and became a mellowed-out, cliche indie pop band. In doing so, they failed to gain any new fans and alienated their old ones. They broke up soon afterward. Nevertheless, their first album is both a unique document of its time in a rock landscape that was drying up, as well as a record that could have pointed the way forward for a talented band had they not been so irrationally opposed to categorization. Chris?
Yeah, they really kind of struck a chord at exactly the right time. It should be noted that this album was released exactly a week after the first inauguration of one Donald J. Trump. And I mentioned the first inauguration because as of this recording, in another week, Donald Trump will be inaugurated once again, somewhat unbelievably. So, yeah, there's a palpable anger, and there's an edge to this album, and just sort of a seething cynicism that really could have been definitive of the times, that it could have just kind of defined that, not necessarily a protest music, but just kind of a mood. It was like the right mood for the right time, where with the election of the game show host, things were officially, even though they had unofficially been going to shit in this country for a long time, they were officially now going to shit. Yeah. And this band, Priests, they could have supplied the soundtrack to the era, and they got off the hell of a start. I love the song "Pink White House." Yeah, personally, that's a really strong punk song. It's pretty clear that as a female, mostly female band, they were hugely influenced by Slater-Kinney, as a lot of young female bands of this era would want to be. And they really could have been something. They really could have held the candle and lit the lighter for a movement. Right. They really had those kinds of chops. But alas, again, they didn't want to be categorized, and they were too cool for school. And it came and it bit them on the ass 2 years later. Yeah. Right. And so, which is too bad. I do like this record. Suck is another standout for me, because it just, all of a sudden saxophone comes into the mix. It's like Slater-Kinney finds saxophone. Who knew? Who knew? So gotta love it. And so, good on you to bring Priests out of the mothballs and to bring them back here exactly 8 years later. And to see where they stand. The album has aged well, I would say. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So for my entry this week, so part of the exercise of the end of the year is, we did the top 10 when we dropped that episode probably the second or third week of December, or we recorded it a week before I took off for a recent vacation to Puerto Rico. So it was mid-December. And when you're in top 10 season, inevitably you're going to miss a couple of spots in the midst of that. And you're still working to consume music in that spot. So after I did my top 10 last year, I discovered this nifty little metal record by a band out of Denver called Blood Incantation, called Absolute Elsewhere. And if I had to do my top 10 over again, I would probably put this somewhere in the middle of that list. And that kind of just proves the fleeting nature of the whole top 10 exercise, right? Here today, gone tomorrow. Yeah. So be that as it may, I would like to tell everyone else out there in Curmudgeon land about Blood Incantation and Absolute Elsewhere. So Heavy Metal Mania is alive and well in the form of Denver, Colorado's Blood Incantation, which released a really powerful and oddly compelling album of progressive death metal. Yes, there is such a thing, called Absolute Elsewhere this past October. The album, which is this band's fourth, was recorded in Berlin and features just 2 songs. Stargate, and The Message, that the band cheekily breaks down into 3 quote-unquote tablets each. Yeah, tablets as in basically movements. And so this ends up forming a 6-track, 43-minute album of alternatingly bone-crunching and mysterious metal fury. What do I mean by mysterious? Well, in the middle of each of these songs, and in the case of The Message, also at the very end, the band turns away from their intensely growling, double bass drum driven death metal in the vein of Morbid Angel and veers towards the sci-fi end of 1970s radio rock for something strangely beautiful and ethereal. It's as if Richard Wright and David Gilmour of Pink Floyd decided to refashion the last third of the song Dogs for a death metal audience. Or if the house band at your local Renaissance fair were invited into the recording sessions just to fuck with us. Blood Incantation also owes a debt to the more electronic end of the mid-70s krautrock scene, something underscored by the fact that Thorsten Quanchning of German heavyweights Tangerine Dream and his synthesizers guest on the Stargate Tablet 2. It's all an impressive blend of musicianship, rock and roll pathos, and metal music craft. And by the end of the 11.5-minute consistently thrashing third tablet of The Message, the album emerges as the headiest, most exciting metal album I've heard in a long, long, long time. And so if you're like me and still catching up on the album releases of 2024, as I was, like I said, back in mid-December, then I strongly recommend that you check out Absolute Elsewhere. And again, if I had to redo my top 10 from last year, this one would probably come in at number 5. So, and again, you know, top 10, you know, here today, gone tomorrow. Who knows, you know, maybe I won't be as big on the MJ Lenderman album either in a year. And all I'll be listening to is Absolute Elsewhere. So anyway, Arturo, what's your thought on this album?
Yeah, this is a band that whose music I respect more than I like. I respect what they're going for. They are going for something different. It's just hard for me to really sink my teeth into it because it's just a little too obtuse, for my own tastes. I don't hear a lot of death metal with this band. I mean, the death metal and some of the drumming, some of the drum sounds that they get is very death metal. To me, it's this band sounds more like the prog metal of early Mastodon, combined with the more electronica side of 1970s krautrock. And you mentioned Pink Floyd. The only Floyd influence that I hear is in track 2, The Message, and it's tablet 2, the middle portion of track 2, The Message. That sounds really Floydish, very Floyd.
Yeah.
I definitely
but there's some other Floyd touches, and I think the middle of Stargate, like both tablets 1 and tablets 2 of the Stargate get into that kind of space invading keyboard type of thing. Yeah. So that's what I mean. But to me, it sounds more like 1970s electro krautrock. I hear more of that. Tangerine Dream.
Tangerine. Well, the actual keyboardist from Tangerine Dream plays on one of the tracks on this album.
Mm-hmm.
Believe it or not.
Yeah, and, as I said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the krautrock influence to me is more so than the Pink Floyd influence, and definitely early Mastodon before Mastodon sold out and became streamlined corporate radio rock back when they were actually good. Now, I hear a lot of that in this.
I do say that death metal is probably a good approximation of their main genre, only because of the vocal stylings. I mean, they have that sort of Bluto from Popeye growl, thing going on in the vocals, and they do kind of sound like Morbid Angel at times. Yeah. And Morbid Angel were like the kings of the death metal scene like 15 to 20 years ago. So they do evoke some of that, but they kind of go in and out of it. And that's why it's more proggy than anything. It's like this prog hybrid of a lot of different hard rock and prog rock styles. And I mean, even the beginning of it, like the tablet 1 of Stargate, gets a little rushy.
Rush.
Just a little bit. It's a little bit rushy. So
Yeah.
so this is a pretty impressive band. I wasn't familiar with them. They were getting buzz on Twitter. I actually still hang out on Twitter sometimes, X
Mhm.
or whatever the
Yeah.
fuck you want to call it. Elon Musk's palace. Uh, but there was some talk going on among some of the rock guys on there about it, and so I checked it out. And hey, liked what I heard. And I'm more into this kind of this crunchy, weird kind of shit than you are. Um,
Right.
in general. I mean, I think I'm
Yeah.
more of more naturally a metalhead. Although
Right.
I don't know, you do have good taste in stoner rock. I'll give you
Right.
that. Like
Yeah. This isn't really. I think
no,
I wish.
it's not
I
stoner
wish.
rock.
I wish these guys would smoke more pot. I think it would,
Yeah, it might
it'd
help
help
them, right?
improve, make their music a little more appealing. A little. They need the trippy. They need the psychedelic element to get me a little bit more into it.
Yeah, I was gonna say
Can we put a Hawkwind influence in your sound?
Chris here again. We usually end our episodes by inviting you to join our Curmudgeonly community page on Facebook. Well, we're picking up our efforts there. Know people just as passionate as us about rock and roll? Invite them to join in the fun. You don't actually need our permission to do so. Also, expect to see a lot more content up there moving forward. Our mission is to engage you, so darn it, we'll engage you like a fire hose, or maybe like a firehouse if we're going to give love to Gene Simmons. We may also be making a few offers. Want to wear a t-shirt featuring our logo? You may have that opportunity soon. So be a fellow curmudgeon, help us expand our little community, and share your own musings via your own posts. We're at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock. 1978, as Arturo said at the beginning of the telecast here, it was kind of an important year because this is a year where punk and hard rock that had come before it coming out of what we called the second golden age of rock between 64 and 72, and then some of the stuff that was hitting the radio in the early 70s. You had the punk movement of 76 and 77, but then something starts to happen in 78 where it travels into this post-punk, pre-new wave. Things get moodier, things get weirder, things get noisier, and things get a lot more artsy all of a sudden. So it kind of, the ethos of punk rock is impatience and basically an aversion to boredom. And I guess the cycles of how they get bored accelerated real quick. and so here comes the post punks, and here comes the new wavers, and they're led by maybe the brattiest of all the brats that came out of this era, Elvis Costello. So Arturo, tell us a little bit about Elvis Costello and this year's model.
Yeah. When Elvis Costello's debut album, My Aim Is True, came out in 1977, right smack in the middle of the punk and new wave explosion in the UK at the time, it and Costello himself was lumped in with the likes of The Clash and the Sex Pistols. On first listen, it's hard to understand why. The breakout hit single from that album, Allison, is a tender, mellow ballad that is so late 1970s in its yacht rock production that it sounds like it belongs in the soundtrack to an episode of Taxi. While it was very much a rock album, the music on My Aim Is True lacked the raw nerve, abrasive, corrosive guitar style of much of the punk of the time. Instead, it sounded, in the best possible way, of course, like a ragged, jaunty bar band, which makes sense considering that Costello's backing band for that album, Clover, actually were a local London pub rock band. Also, with Costello himself, you had a guy who in interviews openly admitted to being influenced by Randy Newman, Hoagie Carmichael, and Cole Porter. Not very punk rock at all.
Nope.
However, if you listen to that album, the sophistication and the classicism in the songwriting just barely masked an angry, nervy energy in the lyrics, innovative in their use of witty wordplay, vivid imagery, and often unsettling storytelling. As brilliant as My Aim Is True was, as exquisitely written as the songs were, and as much as it heralded the arrival of an incendiary new artist, it was clear that Costello needed to beef up the sound of his backing band, even if just to compete with all the punk and new wave bands he was being compared to. Enter The Attractions, with Steve Nive on keyboards, providing his spiky runs and swirling lines, with Bruce Thomas on bass providing his Motown and reggae-influenced grooves, and with drummer Pete Thomas, no relation, bashing out like a young Keith Moon with his virtuoso gift for mind-blowing fills. Costello found a band whose collective muscle matched the power and anger inherent in his songs. Put all that together with a much cleaner, crisper production courtesy of Nick Lowe, and you have this year's Model, a masterpiece of new wave pop punk that established Costello's reputation, remaining to this date his greatest and most loved album, and it became a landmark album in rock history due to its startlingly original sound, and it influenced a whole generation of highly literate new wave pop in the short term and future generations of highly literate indie rock in the long term. Aggressive and bombastic, yet complex with a coiled tightness that evoked the feeling of emotional claustrophobia and anxiety in the lyrics. Costello and the Attractions rocked with a combination of passion and technical precision that many of their peers at the time lacked. Lyrically, Costello drew from his experience working at the cosmetics and perfume company Elizabeth Arden, as well as a toxic romantic relationship with an unnamed fashion model, to create a song cycle of doomed, tortured love turned to spite and all the emotions that come with it. Jealousy, envy, obsession, revenge, and the conflict between what is real and what is shallow artifice. Throughout his career, Elvis Costello would become known for his dizzying stylistic eclecticism and his ability to effortlessly shift from one genre of music to another, from one album to another. On this year's Model, you get a taste of that, but within the confines of spiky, endlessly quirky, new wave pop song constructions. Costello finds the rhythmic midpoint between ska and reggae, as well as a nasty guitar riff on I Don't Want to Go to Chelsea. Little Triggers channels Otis Redding style Southern soul, while You Belong to Me has some serious 1960s references with a jangling guitar riff that's basically a replica of the one from the Rolling Stones The Last Time, and an organ swell straight out of Ray Manzarek's work with The Doors. And of course, there are the album's major hit singles and classics, Pump It Up and Radio Radio, the former being one of Costello's single greatest recorded moments, an adrenaline rush of impeccable power pop with lyrics serving as a scathing indictment of the emptiness and self-importance of people living in high society. The latter, Radio Radio, closing the album on side 2 of the US version, not the UK version, and being one of his catchiest, most melodic and earwormy tracks with those infamous lyrics bashing the conservative commercialization of British radio. Costello is pretty harsh on women on this album, and accusations of misogyny by critics then and now have always left a bit of a black mark on the record. But if you carefully listen to the lyrics throughout the record, Costello points the finger at himself quite often, and he's also at fault. He's also at fault for much of the fallout and romantic psychodrama. This year's Model is an indispensable document of the punk new wave era, as well as an album whose sound and lyrical content have not aged one bit, sounding just as fresh and just as intense as when it came out in early 1978. But Chris, you being the resident Costello hater on this podcast, I'm sure you disagree.
I'm not as much of a Costello hater as I used to be, actually. I've kind of gotten to the point where, to kind of mirror what you had said about Blood Incantation, that I've come to a point where I respect Costello immensely, more than I like him. His stuff never really touched my heart. That, in my head, I know it's strong stuff. I know that it's good music, but it didn't resonate with me emotionally. I mean, there was something almost kind of off-putting about the anger, or about the sardonicness, or about the acerbic nature of everything, or there's just something that I couldn't attach to his stuff emotionally, and so that was what really did me in, and that's still the case. I mean, when I listened to it for this cycle, I'll admit this year's Motto was a great album. I mean,
Yeah.
songs like This Year's Girl, No Action
Mhm.
at the beginning of the album,
Right.
and then you mentioned Radio, and some of the other stuff in there, and Pete Thomas's drumming is just killer throughout the entire friggin' record. I
Right.
mean, it
Right.
just has an energy that jumps out of the speakers, and so I'll give it its props for being a great record. I've just never connected to it on
Yeah.
anything more than than a surface or a superficial level, and so
Right.
that's really where that comes from. I will say that the one of the hallmarks of the third golden age of rock, more
Yeah.
than any of the other three, more than any of the others, is there's that brattiness
Right.
between Joey Ramone's style of brattiness
Right.
and some of the David Byrne style of brattiness and the Iggy Pop.
Intellectual brattiness with him.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's just sort of this Johnny Rotten's kind of this kind of negative snotty energy. Elvis
Right.
Costello was maybe the brattiest of the brats in terms of where he was at the time. And just because he was young, he was like 23 years old, 24 years old when
Yeah.
he did this album, and so
Yeah.
he's just
He was 24 when it came out. Yeah.
yeah, and so he wasn't the most mature guy in the world,
Yeah.
and I think that showed in some of the tumult that he's talking about on these songs, and I will respect him though. There was a method to his madness.
Right.
And I found in the course of researching and getting ready for this episode, I found an interview that he did with Esquire back in
Mm.
2023. He was doing some shows in New York where he was kind of delving into his back catalog. And so he talked to Esquire, and he has this observation about himself and about being a rock musician. And he says this, he says, quote, "To do this job, you divide yourself into an unholy trinity. One is the showman or show off who says
Yeah.
printable, even scandalous things with a pinch of bluff and dare. The
Yeah.
second needs to be a charlatan because even when they are cheering you to the echo, there is always someone at the back thinking, who let that idiot on the stage? I always thought he was overrated, but I'm
Yeah.
ahead of you, mate. I already think that too. Finally, there is something you shouldn't always reveal, like your heart's desire, our worst fears, or what we imagine to be our soul.
Right.
The appetite for explanation has become so much more voracious since the days when pop groups were asked whether they liked steak more than ice cream. It's tempting to think that some acts took more time on the manifesto than the music." And so for him to have that observation, I think is pretty astute.
Well,
About
Costello has always been one of the great intellectuals of rock, you know?
Yeah, and so he has a way of contextualizing himself that he has he's gained a self-awareness over the years, and I think that that's perfect. That there
Right.
part of him was a showman, which is the part that turned me off, because the showman, it wasn't like David Lee Roth, who we'll talk about later in the episode. Like his shtick wasn't one of schmaltz and
Right.
of pure, hey, look at me. It was more sort of this, hey, look at me because I don't want you to be looking at me, and fuck off, and I hate women. And he just had this, and I don't know, there was just something a little bit off-putting about his shtick, but at least he knew it,
Right.
and at least he's aware of it now. So
Yeah.
I just wanted to share that quote with everyone. So yeah, cannot complain about this year's Model. It is a 5-star album. The Attractions were a hell of a backing band, and yeah, Costello, he was an ace songwriter. Just one that never connected with me emotionally, as I've said several times.
All right. Now, next, we're going to talk about post-punk formally arriving. Now, what do I mean when I say that? Okay, so rapid was the rise of punk in 1976 through 77 that it was inevitable that the aftermath effect on rock music, at least in the UK, would be just as rapid. And the year 1978 is when the term post-punk became a thing. If punk rock was about liberation and breaking everything down to its base essence, post-punk was about building it back up and creating something new, but from a more college-educated art school perspective and ethos. It wasn't enough to play unconventional guitar riffs. The entire palette of sounds that the guitar could produce was up for reconsideration and manipulation. It wasn't enough to play odd time signatures and unconventional rhythms. The whole spectrum of drum sounds could be experimented with. This intellectual strain ran through the vast majority of British post-punk bands, eventually finding further expression in goth, early synth pop, and what would eventually be called indie rock. Of course, the band that would become arguably the greatest and most important post-punk band of all time would release their debut LP the following year. But in 1978, there was a series of British bands already exploring sounds never before heard in a rock format. Let's take a look at three of them. Two of them with their debut albums, and one with their second album. After the Sex Pistols imploded in early 1978, singer Johnny Rotten reverted to his actual name, John Lydon, and it didn't take long for him to form a new band, with Virgin Records backing this new endeavor, hoping for a continuation of the Sex Pistols. With dub reggae-loving bassist Jah Wobble and with Sonic Architect guitarist Keith Levine, the record label and music fans got something entirely different indeed. When Public Image Ltd released their debut album, First Issue, in late 78, aside from the band being a standard guitar, bass, drums lineup, musically they were as far removed from the revved up, anarchic sound of the Pistols as possible. Hard rhythms and heavy guitars were still in place, but PIL's sound was more plodding, meditative, more that rather than meandering, leading to a hypnotic, trancy feel, very much in line with Wobble's deeply groove-based bass lines. Levine's guitar also exhibited atmospheric textures that added a sense of open space, as well as a tantalizing unease and unpredictability to the songs. 9-minute opening track Theme encapsulates this new radical approach, with Lydon cathartically screaming out all his anguish from the his post-Pistols depression and how much he wants to die. Grim psychodramatic stuff indeed. Religion 1 and Religion 2 is just as unrelenting, with Lydon spewing forth quite possibly the most anti-religious vitriol ever put on a rock record.
Seriously.
The single Public Image is probably their most conventionally punk track on the album, but as a whole, First Issue presents a new sonic soundscape, an altogether different energy for rock music, only to be surpassed by the band's masterpiece of the following year. One of the other landmark post-punk debut albums from Britain at this time was Siouxsie and the Banshees' The Scream. Edit that out. Ooh, sorry about that. Okay. One more time. One of the other landmark post-punk debut albums from Britain at this time was Siouxsie and the Banshees' The Scream. Siouxsie Sioux, real name Susan Ballion, was a member of the Sex Pistols' large entourage known as the Bromley Contingent, a group of punks, misfits, and artists that palled around with and followed the band for almost 2 years. She formed the Banshees in 76, and they took about 2 years to hone their sound from straightforward punk rock to something more distinctive, original, and altogether removed from traditional punk. In fact, the early Banshee sound had much in common with what Public Image Ltd were doing at the time. The unorthodox guitar sounds, the hypnotic rhythms, the reggae-influenced bass lines. There was one fundamental difference, though, and that was the outright melodicism and adherence to pop hooks that they brought into the mix, being both at odds with orthodox punk and post-punk's then burgeoning anti-commercial ideology. This was never more apparent than in the band's debut single, the infectious, almost effervescent Hong Kong Garden, which went all the way to number 7 in the UK pop chart and made Siouxsie and the Banshees instant stars. It also, in a way, was a preview of the more alternative pop sound the band would embrace later in the 1980s. Their debut album, The Scream, which came out just 1 month before Public Image Limited's debut, didn't contain Hong Kong Garden, but it contained several incredible songs that were emblematic of the Banshees' unique concoction of post-punk experimentalism, punk angst, and catchy pop. Steve Lillywhite's raw bone production is the perfect backdrop for John Mackay's corrosive guitar sound, which employed PIL's Keith Levine's love of unique textures, but also proved to be the perfect sonic complement to Siouxsie Sue's soaring melodies and multi-tracked wails. This is perfectly demonstrated on the album's first half standouts, Jigsaw Feeling and Overground. The intense tribal drumming rhythms of Metal Postcard, perhaps the album's most famous track, lock in with Mackay's equally percussive guitars to create a menacing, lurching sound while Sue enchants with her witty wordplay. Overall, the album is probably the heaviest Siouxsie and the Banshees ever sounded, and quite frankly, the most uncompromising and fascinating version of this soon-to-be ever-changing and ever-evolving band. The third album is this in this segment is the true post-punk masterpiece of 1978, and it comes courtesy of the London band Wire. In the previous episode of this third Golden Age of Rock series, we discussed Wire's debut album, Pink Flag, and how during this time they basically sounded like the Ramones after having spent some time in a British art school. All speed, all adrenaline, songs that are 2 minutes in length or shorter, no solos, no bridges or middle eights, and weird abstract lyrics. However, their second album, Chairs Missing, almost sounds like the work of a completely different band.
No doubt.
If Public Image Limited and Siouxsie and the Banshees were reinventing post-punk rock with unconventional rhythms and never-before-heard guitar sounds, Wire took that ethos and blew it up to widescreen proportions with overwhelming, tension-building dynamics and a foreboding sense of mystery and eeriness. 1 year later, Joy Division and Bauhaus would essentially give birth to goth rock. But on Chairs Missing, Wire created its template. On opening track, Practice Makes Perfect, Graham Lewis's creepy bass line sounds like something that belongs in the soundtrack to Nosferatu, while Bruce Gilbert's guitars mix staccato industrial machine intensity with a feedback wash resembling synthesizers to provide a sense of claustrophobic dread. The disco beat and percolating synthesizer riff that drives Another the Letter is one of the album's few lighter moments, while Sand in My Joints and Men Second come closest to delivering the adrenaline rush of the previous album, albeit with even more abrasive guitars and stabs of dissonant feedback. The slow, ominous crawl of the track Heartbeat is essentially a segue leading to the soft, loud dynamic and full-on vicious assault of the nearly heavy metal Mercy. Outdoor Miner is the album's only concession to punk-flavored pop rock, which, as per the record's Jekyll and Hyde nature of a track listing, doesn't prepare the listener for the next track, the industrial rock grind of I Am the Fly, which sounds like a precursor to the oppressive sound groups like Skinny Puppy would explore in later years. The album ends with a trilogy of the pile-driving stomp of From the Nursery, the atmospheric proto-goth of Used To, and the relentless noise rock drive of Too Late. What with Colin Newman's repetitive mantra singing makes you believe much inferior modern bands like Fontaine's DC just straight up stole for their early sound. Wire would go on to make some great records and experiment with other sounds and styles, particularly electronica and industrial. But Chairs Missing sees them at the very peak of their creativity, versatility, and soon-to-be prevalent influence. Chris?
Yeah, these albums are, I think, are unified by a couple of things. I mean, the thing about post-punk is that it's as much about the noise and the disruption as it is about the songs. And
Right.
like I said, punk rock is aggressive, but it was tuneful.
Yeah.
And I think on these songs, the things are slower, things are louder, things are noisier, things are more abrasive. I think, and it's kind of like purposely being disruptive to get a rise out of folks, and that's especially the case on the Public Image limited record,
Right.
and especially the case on Wires, Chairs, Missing. Not as much as on the Scream, although the cover of Helter Skelter on the Scream kind of gives forth that purpose of kind of redefining rock as this more in your face, almost obnoxious construct that even more obnoxious than punk. Like I said, the punk ethos was that boredom was forbidden, that boredom was verboten, and so they got bored real quick. And had to graduate to something else, and so that's where these records come from. You're right about the Wire record. That's the most striking juxtaposition on any of these records, going from Outdoor Miner to I Am the Fly. It's just like, what in the world? It's like Outside Miner would have fit in on Pink Flag wonderfully. Right. It's a minute and 44 seconds of pure punk goodness. But I Am the Fly is might as well just be like, I don't know, it's like that's like proto Bauhaus. I think you had that you hit the nail on the head. That is proto Bauhaus. And so these are good albums, good bands, important, but it's kind of an underrated thing that people like head straight into Joy Division and kind of skip over this chapter where it's important to look at these, because what you see is the morphing here.
Right.
By 79, things are morphed, but this is the morphing. Right. And all three records are very, very good, very, very strong. Public Image Limited is probably my favorite of the three, just because John Lydon is such a character. Like I said, like even religion, like, I mean, I'm a practicing Christian these days, but even that song, it's everything I hate about the human church. and he hits everything nails on the head. I've always said that worship would be a whole lot easier if it wasn't for the fucking people, and if it wasn't for the actual institution. And so it's a wonderful listen, hearing it. What is it? Jesus Christ, cheap price. Geez, and everybody thought the Sex Pistols were blasphemous. Jeez, man. I'm telling you. So that's what I have to say about post-punk. Okay. Good stuff.
Now, so Chris, you're going to take us from England to New York for three albums, three of these CBGB's bands. All three of these artists had breakthrough pop moments in 1978. Who are they?
Yeah, yes, they did. So we're going to be talking about Patti Smith, the Talking Heads, and Blondie. And albums that they released in 1978. So New York CBGB scene, CBGB, it started off as a scene in the early 70s. By late in the decade, the muscular artsy punk sounds that unified the Fames Club's resident bands had become a movement. And in terms of recorded music, it had become an export of the highest order. Some of these artists and some of these albums that hit record store shelves, remember those? Were truly legendary. We've already covered a few of those during this third Golden Age of Rock series, including 2 albums by the Ramones and monster debuts by Talking Heads, Television, and Richard Hell. Well, the powerful vibes emanating from that shitty little venue on the Bowery continued into and throughout 1978. Here we talk about 3 of those albums. Let's start with Patti Smith's Easter. And we're going to start there. Patti Smith was the first of the CBGB crowd and the regular rotation artists to strike a chord nationally in 1975 with her brilliant tour de force album Horses, which she followed up with aplomb in 1976 with the nearly as impressive Radio Ethiopia. So was she content to ride the wave of her newfound fame and influence on the American punk and hard rock scenes? No way. Quote, I don't fuck much with the past, but I fuck plenty with the future. That's how Smith starts the short but glorious spoken word jam Babelog here on Easter. and damn it, she meant it here on Easter, an album that moved beyond the poetic leanings of horses and delved into full-blown rocker chick territory. Smith always possessed the itchy energy of a beatnik poet, and her artistry shone through consistently throughout her catalog. But she decided it was time to embrace rock and roll charisma and strut like a star in 1978. And this album, as a result, is chock full of noisy guitar licks, swaying rhythm, and full-on growling vocals from Smith. It even grows anthemic at times, as it does most ably on Because the Night, a soaring, triumphant, hook-laden pop tune Smith co-wrote with Bruce Springsteen.
I think Springsteen wrote it for her. I don't think she wrote it at all.
No, she co-wrote it.
Really?
It's a co-write. I think he started it, and then she kind of shaped it and built it up a little bit. So,
okay. All right.
So in 1978, teaming with Springsteen was a pretty sound way to score a hit, and score a hit Smith did, as Because the Night reached number 13 on the American singles chart and climbed all the way to number 5 on the UK singles chart. Other rousing highlights include the acoustic folk stomper Ghost Dance, the surprisingly soulful yet surrealist Space Monkey, featuring what I think is a great lyric. Quote, a stranger comes up to him, hands him an old rusty Polaroid. It starts crumbling in his hand. He says, oh man, I don't get the picture, end quote. And the swinging crunchy rocker 25th Floor. She also confirmed her status as a grade A provocateur with the song title Rock and Roll N-Word. I'm not going to say it, but Rock and Roll N-Word. In a sign that maybe she thinks she took things a little too far with the album's other standout spoken word moment. That song is unavailable for streaming on Spotify, though the rest of the album surely is. But, well, what the heck? Go find Rock and Roll N on YouTube anyway. The song is balls out awesome as a bash out. But in a somewhat startling turn of tone and subject matter, Smith also gets explicitly spiritual and very, very Catholic on the title song, Easter, a mid-tempo appeal to Christ's nature in which she movingly describes herself as, quote, the sword, the wound, the stained, scorned, transfigured child of Cain. And moments later, she describes herself as the salt, the bitter laugh. I am the gas in a womb of light, the evening star. The rebel, it seems, has an obedient heart underneath the tough veneer. Working with the uber-talented producer Jimmy Iovine, Smith crafted a gem of a pure rock and roll album with Easter. She came close to reaching these heights again in 1987 with the amazing single People Have the Power, but really Easter marks the recorded high point for Smith, in my opinion. It's the kind of sonic boom that gives rock geek iconoclasts like us everlasting hope. Now, speaking of giving rock geek iconoclasts everlasting hope, there's the Talking Heads, who in 1978 plunged headlong into their glory years, hooking up with notable experimentalist Brian Eno to co-produce the endlessly fascinating More Songs About Buildings and Food. Talking Heads frontman and chief songwriter David Byrne was an ideal muse for Eno, who took Byrne's never-ending flow of musical ideas and concept and helped him shape it into a visionary palette of white boy, hybrid punk funk, and riveting presentations of modern-day anxiety born from living in a big city like New York. See especially the pogoing husband wife writing team lament Found a Job. More than anything, Byrne and Eno together unleashed the power of the band's rhythm section. Bassist Tina Weymouth and drummer Chris Franz to propel the band towards glory. One song after another pulses with an anarchic yet somehow controlled energy. The Good Thing features a wildly bouncing coda, which segues immediately into the opening bass and drum jam of Warning Sign, which then builds up into one of Byrne's most intriguingly twitchy tunes. They then follow that up immediately with The Girls Wanna Be With the Girls, which is oddly as dreamy as it is cheeky, and it bops along its merry way. The album ends on its highest note, combining a meditative, icy, nearly sociopathic take on Al Green's previously jolly Take Me to the River with one of the best ballads ever written about the fear of mundanity, The Big Country, which features a stinging lyrical rebuke of flyover country. Quote, I wouldn't live there if you paid me, Byrne croons without irony while a steel guitar lathers the song with pathos. Now that I live out here in the yonder myself in these Middle Ages, I kind of get what Byrne was getting at. Ending this otherwise alarm blazing album with such a slow burn diss is a neat out of left field trick, which over the course of the 3 or 4 albums that followed this one, David Byrne proved he was a master of pulling off. More Songs About Building and Food has aged well and has gathered its share of adoring fans within the critical consensus, which is shown by the album's current placement at number 364 on Rolling Stone's list of the 500 greatest albums ever made. Me personally, I'm a bigger fan of the Talking Heads album that followed this one, but that's a topic for the 1979 episode of this series. We'll get there, in 3 episodes. Now, let's talk about Blondie's parallel lines. Blondie frontwoman Deborah Harry was undoubtedly the biggest and best rock star that emerged from CBGB. She was a beautiful, ballsy blonde, seemingly born to lead a rock band in the 1970s, balancing her glamour with a spicy edge that thrust Blondie's music forward with undeniable power. Deborah Harry, her husband Chris Stein, and her other bandmates crafted catchy as hell, punked-up pop songs that became one of New Wave's early templates. The band released its self-titled debut album in 1976, and made an immediate impression in the rock underground with the super fun girl group throwback single Ex Offender. A second album was released early in 1978, in February 78, Plastic Letters, and received a more muted response. And it really wasn't until Blondie released its next album, The Awesome Parallel Lines, later in 1978, that it truly left a broad mark on the rock mainstream. And oh, what a mark. The album is driven forward by taut rhythms and a more rocking sound than it previously had demonstrated. The band, that is, had previously demonstrated. There's also Harry's vocal performance, which is brilliantly expressive and sensual consistently over the course of the album's 12 songs and 39 minutes. Her star shines brightly fresh out of the gate on the album opening 1-2 punch of Hanging on the Telephone and One Way or Another, the latter of which will never, ever fall out of classic rock radio rotation. Harry's command of both songs is positively voracious. She was a supremely confident, supremely sexy punk rock singer. The album reaches its crescendo on Heart of Glass, which belongs on the short list of rock's all-time greatest songs. One of the best electronic drum backbones ever laid down on wax supplies Heart of Glass with its dance floor majesty, and Harry busts out a falsetto on the verses that gives the song its truest sensual character. This was a song to both get your groove and your sex onto, a 4-minute masterpiece of seduction if there ever was one. It's slinky lightning in a bottle, a standout that and a standard that Blondie would not quite reach again, though for the rest of the album it sure has fun trying. Witness Heart of Glass's follow-up, a purely silly little bubblegum pop song called I'm Gonna Love You Too. Gleeful nugget it's a gleeful nugget that on other albums would be a throwaway, but here adds to the overall cult of personality the band presents. And again, what a personality. Blondie enjoyed a run on the pop charts that extended into the early 80s. Back then, oversaturation on the market caused the band to tail off pretty badly, but over the decades, the band has garnered the respect it deserves. Any exploration of Blondie must start with Parallel Lines, however. It's the poppiest and peppiest of these third Golden Age CBGB albums and might rank second to the Ramones' 1976 debut as the most fun of the bunch. Long live Debbie Harry and Blondie. Arturo, what says you about these albums?
Well, first of all, I want to talk about a little thing about Blondie. They always got lumped in with the punk movement. Blondie were never really a punk band.
Not really. No.
They were a pop band. That's what they were. Blondie were a pop band and a really, really good pop band. And their 1960s girl group pop influences really shined through in everything they did from their very beginning up until like when they broke up. And another thing about Blondie, they were fantastic musicians. They were not 3-chord punks. These guys could actually play. Yeah. You know, Chris Stein was a really good guitarist. Clem Burke was a kick-ass drummer. I mean, these dudes could play. Most of these New York CBGB's bands were, I mean, aside from the Ramones, were just really, really good musicians. Patti Smith had a cracking band behind her. Now, speaking of Patti Smith, I think the song Rock and Roll N-Word, the song title and the song itself needs to be explained because there's a lot of context here, okay? All right. Back in 1972, John Lennon wrote and released a song called "Woman is the N-Word of the World." Basically, he was making the point that, of all the ethnic minorities out there who, the disenfranchised, marginalized, ostracized minorities in the world, there is no minority more marginalized, ostracized, and disenfranchised than women in general, and that was John Lennon basically taking the N-word, okay, and putting it on all women, saying no one is more discriminated against than women. So it was basically John Lennon, basically trying to show solidarity with the feminist movement. Okay. 6 years later, this song basically is Patti Smith's response to John Lennon's song, "Woman is the N-Word of the World." And what Patti Smith is saying here, it's basically in the chorus of the song. Outside of society is where I want to be. So basically she's saying, yes, John, yes, woman is the N-word of the world. We are the ostracized, marginalized, disenfranchised minority of the entire world. But I'm okay with it, is what she's saying. I don't want to be part of the mainstream. I don't want to be part of straight-laced conservative society. I'm kind of a freak. I'm kind of an outcast. I've always been that. And I'm okay with it. And I've come to terms with it. And I've come to love myself for it. And on top of that, all the great artists and all the great art we have in our world comes from the marginalized in society. And that's when in the song, Smith starts name-checking all the great artists. Arthur Rimbaud, the French symbolist poet of the late 19th century. He's a rock and roll N-word. Jimi Hendrix, of course, rock and roll N-word. And going all these people, all these artists in music and poetry and literature who come from the margins of society, they're all rock and roll N-words. And Patti Smith is saying, I'm with them. I don't want to be part of the mainstream. I'm okay being a rock and roll N-word. I'm okay being the N-word of the world. So that's what Patti Smith is saying in that song. Yeah. It's not a song about, it has little or nothing to do with ethnicity and race. Right. It really has to do with dissatisfaction.
Independence.
Dissatisfaction with the conservative mainstream of society and preserving artistic independence. That's what the song is about. And that's what people need to know what that song is about. Okay, there. I'm done.
But it was still edgy enough in its language that it's not available on the streaming services.
Right. So, yeah, I know.
Yeah. So
I get it. But people need to understand that's what Patti Smith was going for. I mean, she was never, there's not a racist bone in her body. She's just saying, if John Lennon can take the N-word to mean anyone who is on the outside of society, who is oppressed, like women, okay, well, I can take that N-word and use that to describe people who are outside of society in general. And in Patti Smith's opinion, she's proud of it. She doesn't want to be part of the mainstream. She's okay. It's outside of society is where I want to be. And that's where all the great art comes from. That's Patti Smith's opinion.
Gotcha. Any thoughts about more songs about buildings and food?
Oh man, yeah, I rank it as Talking Heads' second best album. I have it in my list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. I have 3 Talking Heads albums, and that's one of them.
Yeah, is Fear of Music one of those?
No, it just barely misses. I have the first one instead.
Yeah, Fear of Music is one of the best albums ever made.
I love that album too, but you're a little bit more into it than I am.
Yeah, I'm way more into it than you are. Yeah, I'm hugely enthusiastic. I think that's their best record. But more songs about building and food to me is right there, probably a close second. It's really, really strong. So anyway, be that as it may, let us move on. Now we're traveling outside of New York for our next segment, and we're going to Boston.
Wow.
And we're going to be talking about the Cars. Ooh. And it's a discussion I will be leading for us. And so really exciting band. And one of these days of the last 5 years, probably one of my favorite bands. they in my old age, they've become one of my favorite bands. So let's talk about the Cars. Now, we dedicated considerable real estate during the first two episodes of this third Golden Age of Rock series to artists and bands from Boston, Massachusetts. These include Aerosmith, Jonathan Richman and the Modern Lovers, and of course, the mighty, mighty Boston. The mid to late 70s was a high point for the creative rock and roll output from Beantown, so notable that we won't even have room to mention the terrific Jay Giles band past this point. Though, to be fair, Jay Giles didn't really reach its commercial apex until 1982, which sits just outside of our boundaries. But all of that musical output that we've visited to date pales in comparison to probably the best band and certainly the best album to ever come out of Boston. We're talking about the amazing self-titled debut album from the Cars.
Aerosmith would have something to say about that, man. Toys in the Attic, Rocks. I don't know.
Yeah, no. The Cars. To me, this is a better record than those. This album was towering in its influence over the new wave and art punk rock scenes that followed in its wake. As we approach 5 decades past the point of its release, it might not be a stretch to say that the album is actually underrated in the context of talking about the rock and roll canon. Why? For starters, there's the smart, tuneful use of keyboards and synthesizers throughout the album. Those keys, mostly laid down by band member Greg Hawkes, were prominently lifted in the mix, taking their rightful place next to the razor-sharp rhythm guitars to supply the album with texture and joyfulness. Band leaders Benjamin Orr and Rick Ocasek had bounced around together in various bands for years in both New York and Boston before cooking up this keyboard-driven pop formula to magical effect. The Strokes, to mention just one modern-era band, should give the Cars a percentage of its royalties just on general principle, so strong as the Cars pull in their sound. Then there's the incredibly smart songwriting, which combined pounding punk irony with surf rock wistfulness and an uncanny pop melodicism. Just What I Needed, My Best Friend's Girl, and You're All I've Got Tonight are on the very short list of this era's best songs. Rhythmic, baroque, twitchy, moving, instantly recognizable, and instantly singable. There's both a cleverness and a profundity here that makes it all so quirkily powerful. I also love the fact that the Cars feature two singers in Ocasek and Orr, whose vocals are really, 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 really hard to distinguish from one another throughout the album. Seriously, listen to My Best Friend's Girl and the propulsive Bye Bye Love and tell me that that's two different dudes. Hard to do, but it's true. Sure, Ocasek had more of a natural wise guy tone to his phrasings, which is his main giveaway. But when they each played it straight, Orr and Ocasek both drew on a nearly identical, sincere yelp. The Cars, the album, is a 9-song, 35-minute-long masterwork gestated by ultra-competent, ultra-cool Massachusetts boys. Their sleekness proved infectious back in the day, as the album peaked at number 18 in 1979 on the Billboard 200 Albums chart, and both Just What I Needed and My Best Friend's Girl found their way into the top 40 on the singles chart. And those infectious tunes remain stalwarts today. Need a hit of their energy? Just play the keyboard solo in the middle of Bye Bye Love over and over again during a random boring workday. And as an old friend of ours used to say, it'll pump your nads big time. Yeah. For what it's worth, this album sits at number 353 on the Rolling Stone list of the 500 greatest albums. Arturo, what's your thought?
One thing I love the early Cars. They cheesed out a bit too much in the 1980s, but this period, the late 70s period, this one and their second album, Candio, which is fantastic as well. One thing I've always noticed about the Cars, despite their they're known as being the sleek pop rock, new wave pop rock band, but really, like, if you deep inside the Cars, there's a funky art rock band in there somewhere. Songs like I'm in Touch with Your World from the self-titled debut. It sounds like Pavement, with that weird lurching rhythm. It sounds almost indie rockish.
Yeah.
And then you have the last two tracks, Moving in Stereo and All Mixed Up. Those two tracks kind of like they segue into each other. So there's kind of it's almost it sounds like you're listening to something that's thematic. There's an art rock sheen to those last two tracks. And of course, and we'll talk about this in the next episode, but the title track to Candio, the title track to the album Candio, that is almost psychedelic, in its sound effects. So I always like that about the Cars, is that, they were a pop rock band, but they're kind of an art rock band as well. They were early on.
They were really original and really creative songwriters. And then, they could spin yarns like that as well. Right. Like I said, so there's just a quirkiness to their stuff that, at their best, obviously, just what I needed is just as poppy as it gets. Right. But like you said, they have those nuggets in there, like the album tracks that really, bring in like new angles and new shapes and get things to a little bit more kaleidoscopic. And so just a really thrilling band. And I do think that it is by far the best album ever to come out of Boston. I hope Steven Tyler isn't listening to this podcast. Shove it up your arse, Steven. Even that Cars album, that your band never did anything as good as that. Oh yeah, fine. You had the song Sweet Emotion, which is awesome. But other than that, the Cars rocks balls, and you know it. You just know it.
On this episode, we surveyed the year 1978 in our third Golden Age of Rock series. For the next episode, we're going to give some curmudgeonly love to one of the truly great and indispensable icons in the history of rock and pop music, Elton John. From 1970 through 1975, Elton and his lyric writing partner Bernie Taupin produced one of the greatest and most enduring bodies of work the world has ever seen, with timelessly classic albums and sweepingly breathtaking singles that spanned multiple genres and influenced multiple generations of artists for decades to come. With a recent Netflix documentary celebrating the life and career of this great man, we figured the time is right to follow suit with an episode breaking down the historic 6-year, 9-album run that forms the foundation of his legend. Join us next time as the Curmudgeon Rock Report brings you Elton John, 1970 to 75, a legacy. All right, Chris. Now we went from we went from New York to Boston. Now we're going all the way to Ohio for the other new wave pop band debut that is startlingly original. Who is that?
Yeah, that rock and roll bastion of Akron, Ohio, home of Goodyear tires and Devo. So let's talk about Devo and their album Q. Are We Not Men? A. We Are Devo. Which is one of the best that's one of the best album titles ever, and it's pretty much an all-time great art punk album. So let's talk about it a little bit. Devo's chosen moniker is a shortened take on the concept of devolution, that is, the process of becoming lesser or more minimal in nature. Devo then is a fittingly sarcastic name for this would-be avant-garde space rock band, which is among the most innovative and plain strangest bands of its era. Like I said, hailing from Akron, Ohio, this band neatly managed to be futuristic and anachronistic simultaneously. They proved that right out of the starting queue with their classic album, Q, Are We Not Men? A, We Are Devo. Nothing had ever quite sounded like Devo, and nothing has sounded quite like this since. On Are We Not Men, Devo seems to be offering up a score to a weird, wacky science fiction album that never actually got made. Imagine if it had. Whoa. So there's, of course, the famous cover of the Rolling Stones' I Can't Get No Satisfaction, which strips the Jagger Richards classics of its raw sexuality and gives the song a clean, crisp, humorously robotic feel. There's also the song Space Junk, Jocko Homo, Sloppy, I Saw My Baby Getting, Too Much Paranoias, and Mongoloid. which only lightly lay on the electronics and rub them against otherwise crisp rhythm guitars as band leader Mark Mothersbaugh sings, more like yelps, hurriedly about his various obsessions and musings. It all leads to an album that leaves listeners feeling blissfully inert over its 34.5-minute runtime. Though Brian Eno is actually credited as this album's producer, and David Bowie played a part in mixing the album, these guys had some superstar fans right away.
Neil Young.
Yeah, and Neil Young among those fans. Legend has it that Are We Not Men did not deviate too far from Devo's demo recordings of that material, and that they fought Eno to maintain what they had come to the studio with. So that may explain the relatively lo-fi quality of Mothersbaugh's vocals and the lack of sheen to the guitars on the album. No matter, these guys managed to pull off one of the best debut albums in history and left an indelible mark on the history of punk and new wave music. Arturo, what's your thought on Devo?
Yeah, two things about them. First of all, this album came out in 1978. They were recording demos as far back as 1974.
Yep.
These guys formed in the early 1970s. So like they were formulating this kind of music back when classic denim jeans, hairy guitar rock was in style.
And they were doing this weirdo freak flag punk rock.
Yeah.
Yeah,
totally. They were doing this kind of stuff, and also about their music. And you hit the nail on the head. It's really hard to find the influences in Devo. There's nothing that sounds like it. There's nothing that sounds like it like before. Like, what influenced Devo? I have no idea. Listen to the album. What sounds like Devo before Devo? Fucking nothing.
Yeah.
There is nothing that sounds like them before them.
What sounds like Devo afterwards? Almost nothing.
Oh. Well, quite a few have tried.
Yeah, but nothing's quite as crisp. And it has that bite to it that Devo stuff has a bite to it.
Yeah, but I mean, there are some bands. I think Latigue, Kathleen Hanna's band Latigue, post Bikini Kill has a little bit of Devo in them. There's a British band called Snapped Ankles that are very, very, very Devo. They're like Devo done by prog rock.
And I gotta admit, OC's latest record, Sorks 80, dips into some Devo too.
Very much so. And Nirvana covered Devo.
I didn't know that.
Oh, you didn't? Yeah, it's an outtake, and Incesticide, which is their singles, B-sides, and outtakes compilation. They do Stain, which is a Devo cover. So they do that. Yeah, but so they had their impact, but they sounded like nothing else when they came out. That's why I'm not surprised that people like David Bowie and Brian Eno and Neil Young were such like devoted fans early on, because they knew, whoa, this is different.
And funny story that I gleaned from Wikipedia. Apparently, on a trip to Jamaica, Richard Branson of Virgin Records tried to convince Devo to hire John Lydon to be their lead singer. Could you imagine John Lydon and Devo? That's just like two of these things do not go together.
Right. And I don't think it would have lasted long, because those are two really strong personalities, both Lydon and Mothersbaugh.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have worked. They would have clashed instantly.
That would have been an egomaniac's nightmare.
Yeah. All right. Now, let's go. Like every year in this third golden age of rock, there is no lack of great punk, post-punk, new wave rock singles that not only define their era, but have proven to be enduring, timelessly classic songs. Let's run through some of the best of the best. Starting with Roxanne. You don't have to put on the red light. Yes, The Police, Roxanne. In a few years' time, The Police would go on to conquer the world as an arena-filling pop rock band. But in their early period, they were a slightly punk-inflected, deeply reggae-influenced new wave rock band. And this, their first major hit single, was a sign of things to come. I mean, seriously, do you need me to describe this song to you, Chris?
No, not really. I think we all know it. It's It's got a pretty awesome little groove to it, and just Sting at his stingiest
Yeah, very
in the
much so.
vocals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Next, Siouxsie and the Banshees with Hong Kong Garden. We briefly mentioned this song in our segment covering Siouxsie and the Banshees, but it bears repeating that this is one of the most important and essential post-punk and new wave singles of all time. Siouxsie Sue's lyrics indicting neo-Nazi skinheads for their abuse of Chinese immigrants is placed to the forefront, and John McKay's guitar is processed to make it sound like a traditional Chinese folk instrument, giving the song an extra dramatic heft as well as an inescapable hook, even if that hook sounds like the jingle you'd hear in a cheap Chinese restaurant in Springfield, Massachusetts. Chris?
Yeah. Really catchy stuff. And yeah, stop picking on Springfield. I lived in Springfield. Springfield wasn't that bad. What the hell? You could find just as cheesy a Chinese restaurant in Syracuse, New York, where we went to school.
We have.
So stop picking on my dad's hometown. So that's all I got to say about that.
Next, the Ramones, I Want to Be Sedated. For all the timeless genius and cultural importance of the Ramones' endlessly influential debut album, we did make the point in the previous episode of this third Golden Age of Rock series that they were essentially a one-trick pony, and by the dawn of the 1980s, they basically became irrelevant. Yet, this firebomb of a song from their 1978 album Road to Ruin is possibly their last great single. Driving rhythm, catchy guitar riff, catchy verse melody, catchy chorus, a hooky bridge, all the elements of a perfect Ramones song are here. Next, the Buzzcocks with What Do I Get? Like many British youth in 1976, the young men who would go on to form the Buzzcocks were inspired to do so by having their minds blown away by seeing the Sex Pistols live. They released the Spiral Scratch EP in 1977 on a local Manchester indie label, but after lead singer Howard Devoto left them to form another band, guitarists Pete Shelley and Steve Diggle took over co-frontmen duties and, more importantly, distinguished themselves from the rest of the British punk scene by incorporating a Beatlesque melodic sense and unabashed pop hooks into their increasingly tight songwriting. This is one of their most recognizable and signature songs, and it's understandable why Green Day's Billy Joe Armstrong cites them as a core influence. Next, Magazine, Shot by Both Sides. I just mentioned that singer Howard Devoto left the Buzzcocks to form another band, and this is that band. Not quite as listener-friendly or instantly accessible as the Buzzcocks, Magazine, led by incredible guitarist John McGoach, would go on to also play for Siouxsie and the Banshees later on. They distinguished themselves by having a relentlessly driving sound that built an intensity until a cathartic release. And this 78 single is probably the best example of what they were about. Next, Sham 69 with Borstal Breakout. If you like Amyl and the Sniffers, then listen to Sham 69 and you'll see where Amyl got their shit from.
Yep.
This is as bolshy and as working class as punk rock gets, with its rousing anthemic chorus celebrating young reprobates breaking out of a juvenile detention center. Outlaw rock at its rawest and most intense. Next, the Weirdos with We Got the Neutron Bomb. From England, we fly briefly to Los Angeles for one of that city's very first punk bands. They formed in 1975, right around the time music media was catching on to New York's punk scene. And these guys sounded like they could have shared a bill with the Ramones and the Dead Boys.
Yes, they did.
And no one would have guessed they were Californian. This 1978 single is full of piss, vinegar, vitriol, in-your-face antagonism, and all-around foot-up-your-ass punk hostility. Next, The Undertones with Teenage Kicks. Back to the UK we go, and this time to Belfast, Northern Ireland, for that country's second greatest rock export after Van Morrison. This is also a song that legendary BBC DJ John Peel repeatedly called his all-time favorite song all the way until his death in 2004. It's easy to see why, with its perfect song construction and perfect lyrical description of teenaged romantic yearning, all set to glorious power pop. Next, The Jam with Down in the Tube Station at Midnight. By 1978, Paul Weller and the Jam were starting to steer away from conventional punk rock and more toward a new wave-ish pop rock sound that would come to fruition in the early 1980s. However, they still had one foot in the punk rock milieu with this single, their second UK top 15 hit. Lyrically, Weller tells a story of a young man who takes the London Tube, the subway, home and is attacked by a gang of drunken thugs, highlighting the sense of urban decay in late 1970s England. The band rolls along with a new wave pop groove in one of the most vivid and striking borderline pop punk songs of the time. Next, Pere Ubu with Non-Alignment Pact. Back to the USA we go, and this time to Cleveland, Ohio, for one of the most original bands to emerge from the 1970s American punk underground. With more chord changes, twists, and multiple sections than most punk or post-punk bands utilize at the time, Pere Ubu still manages to not alienate the listener with an anthemic chorus and an absolutely killer bass line. Truly a band that should have been bigger than they were. And then finally, The Fall with Bingo Master. We end this lightning round of singles by jumping back to England, Manchester specifically, for a track off the debut EP by The Fall, a band that would go on to become just as much a prolific institution in British indie rock as Guided by Voices would become in American indie rock. Many of the elements that the band became known for are already here. Mark E. Smith's surreal spoken word lyrics, the off-kilter and slightly off-key guitars, the manic, busy rhythms that suggest something danceable. In the years to come, their vast discography would be something bands such as Pavement, Royal Trucks, and Franz Ferdinand would look on for inspiration. All right, Chris, a whole lot of singles there, huh?
Yeah, there's some really great songs on that list too, and it just kind of shows that again, there's more of a diversity coming out, and so you get like pure punk fury, like Non-Alignment Pact, and it's mixed in there with Teenage Kicks, which I kind of agree with John Peel is an all timer of a pop song, and then everything in between, that Sham '69 song is fucking great. He's just so snotty, and but then and then with I Want to Be Sedated, which which was just the Ramones at their most gloriously cheesy. You gotta love it. So yeah, just a lot of solid songs, and it was all over the place. Cleveland, England, Ireland, just all over the place, and just really a really strong smattering of stuff, and just kind of showed where things were going, that these aren't all really, they're not all orthodox punk songs. There's some real pop mixed in there, and there's some real post-punk mixed in there. There's some early new wave mixed in there. It shows a scene in movement.
Yeah,
I think if you had to put it in a way, that the scene was definitely in movement, and it kept on moving into 1979.
All right, so now we move out of punk, post-punk, new wave, and we get to some more of the more established artists in the rock and pop world in 1978. And this next album, while it may not be the best album of 1978, it sure as hell had the most interesting backstory.
Absolutely. Let's talk about Marvin Gaye's "Here, My Dear." Here, comma, my dear. So, "Here, My Dear" is one of the most fascinatingly conceived albums in the history of popular music. It's an album about a specific divorce that was actually and specifically necessitated by that divorce. Seriously. Now, Marvin Gaye was struggling to keep up with the interim financial demands of ongoing divorce proceedings from Anna Gordy, the sister of Motown founder Berry Gordy, who he had been married to since 1964, although the marriage had been floundering for years before it finally dissolved here in 78. Gaye found himself falling behind on alimony payments in addition to floundering emotionally. To settle the divorce case and move forward with his life, Gaye agreed to furnish Gordy with $600,000 from his next album on Motown, half of which would come from the advance for the album and the other half of which would come from the royalties. Pretty crazy. While Gaye may have been relieved that a resolution was now in place, he was still seething with anger and contempt for the way things had gone down between himself and Gordy. Rather than make a garden variety Marvin Gaye album that built on his brilliant streak of music throughout the 1970s, Gaye decided to do something bold and strange. The album that was to half belong or to mostly belong to Anna Gordy would now be about the torment and mourning triggered by the divorce from Anna Gordy, rendered in unsparing detail. The resulting album, which Gaye darkly called "Here, My Dear," is with an image of him as a kind of a Greek statue with his hand out, like almost like a hat and hand gesture. It's just really, really funny album art. It's ostensibly an R&B album that dabbles throughout in a blend of spacey funk and jazz, but it's really a sloppily confessional, ramblingly perturbed mind on display as Gaye walks through the various contours of his feelings about where the dissolution of the relationship with Gordy had left him. There's as much self-therapy going on here as there is revenge. The album titles here help tell the story. I met a little girl. When did you stop loving me? When did I stop loving you? Anger, Anna's song, time to get it together. You can leave, but it's going to cost you. And the very, very extremely tersely branded, is that enough? Gaye oscillates between forensic complaints about the divorce itself and the better, sweeter memories of the woman he lost. There's a welcome sweetness to the bouncy, lilting Anna song, following as it does from a litany of figurative moaning and groaning. He actually does have love deep in his heart for his ex, regardless of the current predicament. The song is beautiful and richly affecting as a result. In the midst of all the catharsis, Gaye finds the artistic space for what is my favorite song on the album, the goofy, clearly Parliament-inspired A Funky Space Reincarnation, a romp about moving and grooving 100 years or so down the road. It's a nice break from what otherwise is undoubtedly the heaviest emotional ground Gaye ever covered as an artist. It signals that despite the dread and the cloud of weary nostalgia he's experiencing, there's joy and buoyancy still to mine within his soul. Divorce and court decrees, it turns out, haven't actually killed him. Unsurprisingly, then, given the relative lack of commercial flair and focus to these wild and woolly songs, the album performed relatively poorly on the charts, and a long period of self-imposed exile by Gaye followed. Anna Gordy threatened legal action for invasion of privacy, but never actually followed through, eventually recognizing the artistic merit of the work. Despite its failure to launch as a hit and its awkward, outrageous origin story, Here, My Dear deserves mucho respect as a portrait of an artist under duress who was nevertheless unafraid to let us in on his torment. His grand, deliberate, now go the fuck away paean to his ex-wife turned out to be quite a gift to the rest of us. Arturo?
This album is actually a double album.
Yes, it is.
Again, goes to my theory. Most double albums are either among an artist's best work or it is their best work. In this case, I rank it as Marvin Gaye's second greatest album after, obviously, What's Going On. Another thing, a track on disc 2, You Can Leave, but It's Going to Cost You. Mm-hmm. The word for word, that is exactly what Anna Gordy told Marvin Gaye when he wanted to divorce her. And that's why he named the song that way. It's actually a quote from Anna Gordy. You can leave, but it's going to cost you.
And boy, did it.
It did it. One thing about this record, the lyrics, the marital strife and just the emotional turmoil going on. But the music is not like that at all. There's a spaciness to the music. It's almost trippy and kind of sort of psychedelic.
Yeah.
It's like spacey jazzy. Much of this record is that, which is really just goes contrary to just the abrasive quality, the abrasive nature of the words. That juxtaposition I always find really fascinating in this record. And what I love about this record exactly is that, and it's in some ways it's Gaye's boldest album. I mean, What's Going On is seen as his boldest album because of all the socio-political commentary, but he's putting, I think, more of his balls on the line line.
Oh yeah, much more
record.
of his balls on the line. This is like him tearing it. This is like him putting his entrails out on a platter.
Yeah.
You
You know,
know, I mean, it's brutal. It's a brutal listen.
it is. And that's probably why it wasn't as commercially successful, because it was hard to listen to.
Because
But
he's just as angry at himself as he is at Anna
yeah,
on these songs, and so that's what makes it such a compelling listen. And
Right.
and it's fascinating because, you know, like the opening track, "I Met a Little Girl,"
Yeah.
is 3 minutes of pure doo-wop. It's a throwback doo-wop song,
Right.
but it's about, you know, basically about getting fucked over in divorce court. Is and it gets right to the point. And so
Right.
it's really, like you said, the juxtaposition is just really striking throughout the album for sure.
Yeah, fascinating record. One of the most underrated albums of all time, and I think it's a top 500 of all time record myself. I put
Yeah,
it
and actually, Rolling Stone agrees with you. It's at 493
in.
on the current list.
I think it should be higher. All right, now next, truly one of the greatest albums of all time. From one kind of emotional anguish to another. Chris, tell us about Bruce Springsteen.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about "Darkness on the Edge of Town," which I think both of us agree is his best album, and just one of the more triumphant songs in the American rock canon for sure. "Darkness on the Edge of Town" came on the heels of two defining episodes for Bruce Springsteen. The first was the breakout success of his 1975 album "Born to Run," which left the boss marked as the next great American rock and roll hope in the press. The second was a prolonged legal fight with his former manager, Mike Apple, which had the effect of keeping Springsteen and his E Street Band on the road and out of the studio for much longer than they had hoped or desired. So once Springsteen did land in the position to finally follow up "Born to Run," he was on a mission to prove his mastery and perfect his craft. His task was to conjure music and resultant emotions that matched his artistic ambitions. And with "Darkness on the Edge of Town," the man met the moment gloriously. I've always felt that "Darkness" is Springsteen's best album, serving as a sterling portrait of American restlessness and frustration. The album launches with "Badlands," a rousing up-tempo ode to the everyman finding himself running in place. His protagonist truly does believe in the faith that will save him, even if reality is in a much bleaker position, something that Roy Bittan's twinkling electric piano notes and Clarence Clemens' saxophone solo drive home magnificently. Badlands then gives way to "Adam Raised a Cain," one of Springsteen's nastiest rockers ever, one that proves that the guy could solo pretty damn well when he allowed himself to. Later, Springsteen pays homage to an Americana that he didn't actually grow up in, but nevertheless fascinated him to no end, cranking out the awesome power ballad "Racing in the Street," the cautiously optimistic rocker "The Promised Land," and the smolderingly romantic "Prove It All Night," which I love. These songs are unrelentingly tight and focused, and through the imagery may grow dark at times. Let me start that over. These songs are unrelentingly tight and focused, and though the imagery may grow dark at times, they never stop mining in hope and a longing for transcendence. That's especially true on the title song, which closes the album. This lyric, in which there's truly nothing left to lose, is especially moving. Quote, "Now some folks are born into a good life, and other folks get it anyway, anyhow. Well, then I lost my money, and I lost my wife. Them things don't seem to matter much to me now. Tonight I'll be on that hill, 'cause I can't stop. I'll be on that hill with everything I got. Lives on the line where dreams are found and lost. I'll be there on time, and I'll pay the cost for wanting things that can only be found in the darkness on the edge of town." Now, that's an edginess that Springsteen and his bandmates counterbalance with beautiful arrangements throughout the record. This is one of the most inspired and plainly inspiring listens in all of rock and roll. Springsteen was never better than he was on "Darkness on the Edge of Town" for sure. Arturo, I'm pretty sure you agree with me on that.
Mostly agree. For the record, I have it as Springsteen's second best record myself. I still go with Nebraska.
Okay.
That's still my favorite. And there's a movie coming out later
Yes.
this year
About the making of Nebraska.
About the making of Nebraska. It's not quite a biopic, but it is, a film, with actors playing the part of Springsteen and his band, and it's about Bruce struggling with his emotional and mental depression during the time, and when he wrote the songs on Nebraska. But anyway, that's my favorite Springsteen album. Think about two other things. Whereas Born to Run, the main theme of that album really was wanting to get out, wanting to escape and just, escape your reality, escape your home, escape your hometown, escape your life, and just the desperation of needing to get out. Darkness on the Edge of Town, as the title of the album basically indicates, is once you get out, this is what you find, and it's not so good.
Yeah.
So you don't want to go back to where you were, but if you keep going forward, it's just as bad, if not worse. So you're kind of caught in this neither world of shit.
Yeah, it's like, but hope propels you even though it gets bleak, and even though it stays bleak.
And basically,
and that's the main thing.
Yeah, and you have to be hopeful, because without the hope, you have nothing else, is basically what I think Bruce is saying on this album. Also, Mojo Magazine, every year they devote 2 or 3 issues a year to like a particular artist or band, and they count down the 50 greatest songs by a particular band or artist. They've done it for everybody: Beatles, Stones, Who, Zeppelin, Bowie, Smiths. They've done them all. Fleetwood Mac. They've done, and when they did it for Bruce Springsteen a couple of years ago, Racing in the Street was #1.
Yeah, that's not a bad call. It's not what I would put #1, but it's pretty damn close. That's a special song.
Yeah, that is Mojo Magazine's pick for Bruce Springsteen's greatest track. It is one of his all-time. It is one of the all-time greatest rock record. Forget rock. One of the 100 greatest albums of all time, period, and arguably his best album. And I'll definitely go with that. Okay, now the last major segment we have for this episode. We're going a little bit away from Bruce, and we're going all the way to California. Why? Well, here we go. We're going to talk about the earth-shattering debut album by Van Halen. By the late 1970s, heavy metal was in a bad place. The Ozzy Osbourne-led Black Sabbath were on their last legs and making some truly terrible music. Excessive drugs and alcohol had made half of Led Zeppelin a spent force and an irrelevant dinosaur act. Deep Purple had become a joke with all their lineup changes and out-of-touch music. Bands like Judas Priest and Iron Maiden were about to set off a mini quote-unquote revolution with their cheesy cartoon metal. Motorhead were about a year or two from really breaking big, and thrash metal was still a few years away. AC/DC were starting to break big, but their brand of no-frills, sweaty, grimy bar band metal lacked the flamboyance and flashiness that many metal fans at the time craved. Enter a pair of immigrant brothers from the Netherlands, now settled in Pasadena, California, whose love of hard rock inspired them to form their own band in 1972. Whiz kid and dazzling virtuoso guitarist Eddie Van Halen and hard-hitting drummer and older brother Alex Van Halen were inspired by their love of Cream, Led Zeppelin, and, due to Eddie's classical piano training, classical music to form a band called Mammoth. An outgoing and outspoken young transplant from Indiana named David Lee Roth joined them as lead vocalist in 1973 and convinced them to change the band's name to simply Van Halen. When Michael Anthony, a classmate of Eddie's at Pasadena College, joined them on bass in 1974, their soon-to-be classic lineup was complete. They spent a few years playing all over Southern California in dive bars, small clubs, backyard parties, high school dances, city parks, and local festivals. By 1975, they became a fixture of the Los Angeles music scene, playing renowned clubs and venues on the Sunset Strip, such as Gazzari's, Myron's Ballroom, and the Whiskey A Go Go. Fun fact, in the summer of 1976, Gene Simmons of Kiss was tipped off to this hot new band by notable LA DJ and club owner Rodney Bingenheimer. Simmons promptly took Van Halen to the studio and produced a 29-track demo tape. He took it to Kiss's management, and they immediately rejected it, thinking the band had no chance of making it. Well, when one window closes, another one opens. Another musician, not quite as renowned as Gene Simmons, by the name of Doug Messenger, was knocked out when he saw Van Halen perform live. Messenger was the guitarist and band leader for Van Morrison's band at the time, and he knew Morrison's manager, Ted Templeman, was looking for a hard rock act to manage. On Messenger's encouragement, Templeman and Mo Austin, the head of Morrison's record label Warner Brothers, went to a club called the Starwood on a rainy night in the summer of 1977 to check Van Halen out. They were so impressed that Austin wrote a letter of intent on a napkin, handed it over to the band, and within a week, Van Halen signed a contract with Warner Brothers and landed a slot on a national tour opening for Journey. This was the beginning of an avalanche-like momentum that would, by the mid-1980s, see Van Halen become the biggest hard rock / heavy metal band on the planet. But what really got that avalanche in serious motion was the critical and wild commercial success of their self-titled debut album, which came out in early 1978. They were loud, they rocked balls, they had a super charismatic and flamboyant frontman, and most importantly, Eddie Van Halen was an overwhelming force of nature as a guitar player. Overnight, Eddie redefined what heavy metal guitar playing could be. With his virtuosity, his impact on heavy metal was the equivalent of what Eric Clapton did for blues rock in the mid-1960s and what Jimi Hendrix did for rock overall in the late 1960s. The band as a whole reset the parameters of heavy metal presentation with glam rock inspired colorful costumes, lots of hairspray, and a flash and panache that, when taken together as a whole, immediately became a touchstone influence on the glam / hair metal movement soon to kick off in the early 1980s. It's often said that you shouldn't blame the innovators for the imitators. And that's especially true when it comes to Van Halen and the explosive rock and roll on their first album. The grinding, stomping, running with the devil, flushed with Eddie's flurry of lead lines, is one of rock's all-time great album openers. Then Eddie really lets it loose with the instrumental Eruption, quite possibly one of the most important moments in heavy metal history, a track that inspired legions of teenagers to pick up and learn the guitar. This segues into a barnstorming version of the Kinks' You Really Got Me, one that matches the original for its brutal, if campy, delivery. Other all-time roof-blowing classics abound on this record. Jamie's Crying, Atomic Punk, Ain't Talking About Love, and a cover of Chicago bluesman John Brim's Ice Cream Man. Use your imagination to find out what that song is about.
Yeah, seriously.
All of these are thrust into hyperspace by Eddie's guitar pyrotechnics. His guitar work every bit as important as the British post-punk guitarists' work for conjuring new sounds never before heard in a rock format. Van Halen's debut is one of the greatest debut albums ever made by anyone in any genre of music, and it's a milestone, if not a turning point, in the history of heavy metal. Chris?
Yeah, I love early Van Halen. I mean, how can you not? I mean, the charisma, and just the performance chops, and just they had a few secret. They had a couple of secret weapons. I mean, one, everybody talks about Eddie Van Halen as being a virtuoso, but a lot of people give Alex Van Halen a short shrift. That guy was a kick-ass drummer.
No way,
That guy had octopus arms, and then also the harmony singing by Michael Anthony. Backing up David Lee Roth on the choruses. You can hear that on Running with the Devil. You can especially hear that on Ain't Talking About Love. I mean, he adds a real depth, to the vocals on both those songs. And the amazing thing about Van Halen to me is that Eddie Van Halen was self-taught.
Yeah,
as a musician, which is just mind blowing when you hear stuff like Eruption. where he's basically doing Mozart on the fretboard of an electric guitar.
Yeah.
And you're like, that dude is self-taught. Like he didn't deal in just chords. He wasn't a three chords and a dream kind of guy.
Right.
He was an absolute virtuoso, but self-taught, and probably fueled his addictive personality, that he used to say that he would do the cocaine to rev him up so that he could work on his songs. And then the alcohol was his come down from that. And so it was never about partying for him. It was all about, kind of feeding the genius. So yeah, just great stuff. I love Ice Cream Man. That's such a fun song. And I love Ain't Talking About Love, because I swear to God that song's got like a chord and a half.
Yeah.
It's like such a simple song. It's maybe two chords, but they just rock it out, and just good stuff. And this is all stuff that we grew up on. And it's just absolutely indelible. Will never die. Running with the Devil, Eruption, You Really Got Me, Ain't Talking About Love, Jamie's Crying. None of those songs will ever fall off of classic rock radio. So love Van Halen. Absolutely love them. Can't get enough of them.
Okay, we are nearing the end. We've talked a lot about a lot of albums and a lot of singles. And there's some other great albums in 1978 that deserve some love and deserve some attention. So we're gonna end this episode with a lightning round of other classic albums of 1978, but we'll do it quickly. The first one, Neil Young with Comes a Time. Finally, I get to lead off on a Neil Young album.
Yep.
By 1978, Young's record sales had slowed down since his commercial peak with Harvest 6 years earlier, but he still had a sizable, passionate following, and he was in the middle of a run of brilliant albums that made him a perennial critic's favorite. Nevertheless, he felt it was time to get back that casual fan audience that After the Gold Rush and Harvest brought him. Hence his return to country rock with Comes a Time, and it's one of his very best. Most known for having the lovely country pop song Lotta Love, a song that Nicolette Larson covered and had a top 10 hit with. But there are other great classics here, none more enchanting than the gorgeous violin-driven title track. There's also the stately Human Highway and the low-down, sultry, swampy blues rock of Motorcycle Mama. It's an album that gets unfairly overlooked in the pantheon of great Neil Young albums. Chris?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a very, very strong record, and it's coming off a really productive writing period he had in the second half of 1977. He just released an album, and it's actually it's one of the records that's on the third volume of the Archive series, but he released it as a standalone record called Oceanside Countryside, and the countryside portion of the record features a lot of early versions of songs that made this record, like Human Highway and Motorcycle Mama and stuff like that, and Comes a Time. But the album proves that he could pull a commercial hit out of his ass anytime he wanted to.
Yeah.
He just had that kind of talent. Oh, it's time to make some money. Okay. La, 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 la. Yeah. and here comes the dough. But yeah, just a lot of lovely stuff. I mean, really lovely cover of Four Strong Winds that closes the record. And even the corny stuff works. Like Fields of Opportunity is a really corny song, but it's fun. It's a fun, corny song.
Right.
So, So Neil at his charming and most commercial, but that which means he was at his most successful.
Right. Next, XTC with White Music. The alternative pop band XTC never broke big outside the UK, but whatever global following they have is pretty strong and almost cult-like. Most XTC fans tend to like their stuff from the 1980s and early 90s. To me, most of that stuff is bland, generic pop rock, just barely more tolerable than most mainstream pop, even if Andy Partridge's lyrics never really lost their keen insight and socio-political edge. I much prefer early XTC, the late 1970s, early 80s vintage, because it's more unique, it's more original, and frankly, more influential on a few future generation of Britpop bands and artists such as Blur, Pulp, and Elastica. Their early sound is characterized by really quirky and angular guitar riffs and bass lines, offbeat stop-start rhythms that sometimes veered into odd time signatures, really quirky and almost diabolically insane vocal phrasing that managed to stay on key as well as be melodic. And again, Partridge's caustic wit and barely concealed socio-political rage in his lyrics. All these elements are firmly in place on their debut album, White Music, with classic songs such as Radio's in Motion, This Is Pop, and Statue of Liberty. Chris?
Yeah, Statue of Liberty, definitely an all-time classic. I actually like Skylarking from the mid-'80s. I think that's a really strong record and probably, to me, their best album. But it was interesting. I wasn't all that familiar with this album before now. But you're right. Just there's an angularness to it that really stands out. And effectively the second best cover of All Along the Watchtower is on this album because it has that kind of quirky, twitchy white boy funk thing going to it. And so really neat trick there. And Andy Partridge was a huge talent. Huge talent. And XCC's kind of a sad story because, they had a bad management contract and a bad record contract. And so they had a good run of success in the throughout the 80s, never made any money. Yeah. And so they basically, they broke up, I think in the early aughts, but they never made any money. So they were broke, So it's real sad case.
All right, next, Kraftwerk with the Man Machine. In the previous episode in this series, we talked at length about the German electronic band Kraftwerk and their landmark 1977 album Trans-Europe Express. But their follow-up album, The Man Machine, deserves almost as much acclaim and reverence. Lyrically, the album is rich with the theme of the convergence between humanity and technology, something that is more than relevant in today's day and age. Despite Kraftwerk's purely electronic sound and otherworldly European sense of cool, what always made Kraftwerk's music impactful and resonate to this day is the actual warmth and humanity in their songwriting and how melodic and catchy their songs are. Tracks like The Robots, Space Lab, and Neon Lights are a testament to this, as is the stunning song The Model, which delves into the existential angst of human identity and what is more real, the persona we put up for others to see or what we hold back and don't want to show. Chris?
We are the robots. Just great stuff. This might as well be Trans-Europe Express Part 2. Because it keeps that train rhythm. They had an obsession with trains, so it kind of keeps that train rhythm going. And the motorique is definitely on display. And I like that. In some ways, it's even more thematic than Trans-Europe Express because you're talking about that overtaking of technology. And the relationship there, and then that sort of realism versus surrealism, and those types of things. And so just really powerful album. The Volkander stuff is even funkier here than it was on Trans-Europe Express, and so not a better record, but it's a more. I think it's like a more assured work is because they had already pulled it off in Trans-Europe Express, and now they're really just taking that and running with it powerfully.
Yeah. Next, Funkadelic with One Nation Under a Groove. In the early 1970s, George Clinton's outfit Funkadelic were one of America's greatest, most distinctive, and most important bands, merging R&B, soul, funk with psychedelic rock. Unfortunately, despite some decent success on the R&B charts, they never really crossed over to the mainstream. Clinton hit the mainstream jackpot, however, in the mid-1970s when his other band, Parliament, focused solely on funk grooves and the dance floor, eventually becoming an arena-filling headline act. But Clinton always wanted some of that commercial success to go to Funkadelic, and he finally achieved that in 1978 when the title track to One Nation Under a Groove became a worldwide booty-shaking hit. Other outstanding funk jams are Who Says a Funk Band Can't Play Rock and Charlie, Funk Getting Ready to Roll. While Funkadelic's rock funk fusion lives on with Lunch Meat-a-phobia, Think It Ain't Illegal Yet, and Pro Mental Shit Backwash Psychosis Enema Squad, The Doo-Doo Chasers. Chris?
But yeah, no one knew how to crank out mature song titles quite like George Clinton. Yeah, the old expression, you're only young once, but you can stay immature forever.
Yeah.
I think George Clinton pretty much proved that adage. Yeah, by this point there really wasn't much of a difference between Parliament and Funkadelic, except
Sure.
one. The Funkadelic was I guess an overall tighter band. I mean, it wasn't as sloptastic as the Bootsy Collins stuff on Parliament. But at this point, he's going for Funk Glory with these guys as much, because it was always the divide. Was Funkadelic was the acid rock and Parliament was the pure dance floor funk. But I think that those lines have pretty much been blurred, and George Clinton is just doing George Clinton across the board. And One Nation Under Groove, marvelous song, just a hip shaker extraordinaire.
Yeah. All right, next, Rush. Hemispheres. This album represents the third and final installment in Rush's trilogy of mostly space rock concept albums that started with 1976's 2112 and continued with 1977's A Farewell to Kings. During this time, their fan base grew exponentially, and Hemispheres had them poised for an even bigger commercial breakthrough a couple of years later. Of course, the album's central track is the epically long, even for them, and engagingly complex 18-minute Cygnus X1 Book 2 Hemispheres. Drummer Neil Peart was the band's intellectual lyricist, and it doesn't get more intellectual than The Trees, a rather accessible piece of a mini prog rock done to catchy arena rock size, with lyrics about maple trees forming a union to cut down the oak trees because the oak trees are taking in all the sunlight, only to find that all trees would be kept to equal size by human-made cutting tools. Deep, man. Still, a kick-ass album by Rush in their halcyon years. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. They would never get this proggy again. It kind of sets them up for their success that they had in the next couple albums with Permanent Waves and Moving Pictures. This is kind of where they leave the space jams behind, because La Via Strangiato is on this record too, which is got one of their better bass lines. Yeah, or one of Geddy Lee's better bass lines on it. And I love the fact that they actually named a song Cygnus X1 Book 2. I mean, it doesn't get more sci-fi than that, baby.
Well, Book 1 was on a Farewell to Kings, right?
Yeah. It was just Cygnus X1.
Yeah.
So that's Book 1. And then Book 3 was The Weapon, which shows up on Signals in 1982. So that's some Rush trivia for you folks out there.
Yeah.
So but they never got this proggy again. And I used to love this record when I was 19. This is probably my favorite of the Rush records. I don't know. There's just something about the bass play and there's something about the production in here that really resonated with me. That it's a really thumper of a record. And then the Trees, you gotta love it. It's so goofy. There is trouble in the forest. It just they play it straight. They don't even know that they're making a ridiculous song. They think this is the most profound statement of all profound statements, which is what makes it so entertaining. So Hemispheres, it holds up, and it was like their last prog hurrah before they went big, before they went truly big.
And the final album in this lightning round, The Rolling Stones, Some Girls. In the several years leading up to Some Girls, the Rolling Stones were still one of the biggest bands in the world, and their albums were still selling very well. But their hit singles, while charting high on release, weren't having as much staying power anymore. They were on the verge of becoming a legacy act with an aging fan base. But with the polar opposite towers of punk/new wave and disco having become the main influencers in pop music's landscape at the time, the Stones found artistic and commercial rebirth by tapping into both wells. The result was Some Girls, an album produced by Mick Jagger and Keith Richards themselves that also found them rocking out in a ferocious way they never had before, thanks to the energy and spirit of punk that they infused in songs such as When the Whip Comes Down, Lies, and Respectable. Seriously, if you ever wanted to hear what a punk rock version of the Stones sounded like, the Stones themselves did that here. The influence of disco reared its head on Miss You, a luscious mid-tempo groover that was the band's biggest hit since Angie, and it was a top 10 hit all over the world and #1 in the US. An utterly sexually lascivious blues song is never far away from the Stones' reach as it is with the title track, where Jagger notes down all the kinds of girls in the world, ethnically and nationally, and what they want from men, or more likely from him. Yep. For the record, Jagger has always maintained the lyrics and the song in general are a parody of the prejudiced people who hold those kinds of attitudes. Okay.
Yeah, sure. Sure.
Beast of Burden, another huge hit, is one of the 2 or 3 best soul ballads they ever did. Shattered, perhaps the album's best song, draws on the edgy new wave pop of the time, with Richards' guitar given a phaser sound effect for that sci-fi feel, while Jagger snidely sing-speaks about his observations of late 1970s New York society. It's one of the Stones' 5 very best albums, in my opinion, and is one of only 2 albums by 1960s rock legends, the other being Neil Young's Rust Never Sleeps, that holds up with the best of the punk, post-punk, new wave classics of this third golden age of rock. Chris?
Yeah, great album, and Disco Dance Boy at the height of his powers.
Yeah.
Mick Jagger, that was Keith Richards' derisive nickname for him during this period. Disco Dance Boy. Yeah. And so there's a lot of great grooves on this record, especially Shattered, especially Miss You. Some Girls, the title track is fantastic as well. Yeah. I gotta say, this is actually the first album in which Ronnie Wood really kind of comes into his own.
Sure.
With the Stones. I think it took him a while to find his footing, because essentially, he wasn't the virtuoso lead player that Mick Taylor was, and he wasn't the multi-instrumentalist that Brian Jones was. But what he could do was he could play an adjunct character to Keith Richards, that he was a complement to Richards as far as extending the rhythms. And so there was a lot of the slide guitar stuff that Ron Wood did. It didn't venture too far from the riffs, and so there's a lot of doubling off of the riffs, and there's a lot of kind of slinking in and out of the riffs with a lot of, and so it's pretty subtle. But Wood's guitar playing on Beast of Burden is absolutely fantastic. As kind of it's almost like rhythm plus, more than true lead playing. It's rhythm plus, and it really stands out, and it really drives that song, and makes it special. So got to give it up for Ron Wood. And this is what kind of the record where he defined how he was going to fill his role for the Stones going forward. So great album.
So we have reached the end of 1978 in our third golden age of rock series. We are done. And for the next episode, we're going to stay in the 1970s, and we are going to discuss the legacy of one Reginald Dwight, otherwise known to the world as Elton John.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to talking about Sir Elton, who's now blind, unfortunately.
Really?
Yeah, he had an illness last year, and he lost his sight.
All of his sight?
Yeah, as far as I know, he's completely blind now.
Oh God.
So kind of a tragic thing. But he with the music endures, especially his early 70s to all the way through the mid 70s. His stuff was sterling, and really, I guess arguably even the late 70s. He still has like Saturday Night and stuff like that. So definitely looking forward to talking about Elton. And 1978, hell of a year, hell of an important year, transitional, very transitional, I would say. And so with that, folks, as we always do at the end of these episodes, this is episode 98, by the way. We're approaching episode 100, so that's kind of exciting times in the life of the Curmudgeon Rock Report. We want you to join our Facebook's Curmudgeonly community and join us up there and join in the merriment and mirth of Arturo's postings up there, and sharing some really cool YouTube videos and engaging you. And we have some frequent flyers as far as followers up there. We appreciate all of you, and we want to grow that community. So if you go to facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock and ask for an invite in, chances are we'll let you in. You'd have to be a real cretin for us not to let you in. So if you have anything to say about this episode, if you disagree with any of our statements on 1978, if you think Van Halen's even more awesome and we shouldn't have waited so long to talk about him, let us know. curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. Drop us a line. We'd love to hear from you. And as we've been doing, we started this at the beginning of last year and we're continuing it now. We'll be producing a Spotify playlist with a chock full of 1978 music for you to enjoy. If you look at the episode description wherever you're accessing this podcast, whether it's Apple or Amazon or Stitcher or wherever else you're accessing the podcast, just look for that episode description and look for that link, and it'll take you to the Spotify playlist, and you can enjoy the music that we're talking about. It's not just two white guys talking dryly about rock and roll. You can have it come to real Technicolor life